Good morning. I'm Matt. I'm the pastor here. We're glad you're with us this morning. What a great time to sing together, to worship together, to gather together. I love Journey Church, and I love our moments together as we gather together on Sunday mornings. We are actually in a series right now, and just to let you know, a series is basically where we decide to talk about something for a few weeks at a time, try to keep one theme kind of going together, even though we kind of address something different every Sunday. This particular series is called Don't Hate the Messenger, and what it's about is about the prophets of the Old Testament. We decided a couple months ago, if you were with us, we did this big 4-week series, kind of an overview of the entire Old Testament, and we had one Sunday, just one Sunday, where we tried to kind of give this big broad stroke of all the prophets for thousands of years, what they were for, why they were there, what their purpose was, what God was doing with them, and why. And it's very difficult to do that in one Sunday morning. It's very difficult to do it in a series, but what we decided to do, we knew ahead of time, is, hey, we're going to look at it this summer. We're going to spend a few weeks looking at taking different prophets, kind of in chronological order, some you've heard of, some maybe you have never heard of, and talking about what God used them for, what they did and the time and place they were there, and what can we learn from them today. Listen, I'm definitely the guy that thinks newer is better. Everything newer has got to be better. So it was a long time before the Old Testament actually came alive, even to me personally. But there is a lot to learn, and there's a lot to be gleaned in our lives currently today, even from these guys, men and women who, a lot of times we have this picture of prophets like craggy, crunchy old men with staves and, curmudgeons kind of thing, but they're amazing. And so last week we started the series. Zach kicked us off, and he gave us kind of a brief kind of overall idea of what we want to use as a description and a definition of a prophet at its base level, and it's this. The prophet is someone who speaks the truth of God to others. Now, there's a lot of context. There's a lot of specific things about prophets in terms of the Old Testament that we can dive into, and we will. But from a basic term, from the basic understanding, what was a prophet was someone who spoke the message of God, spoke the truth of God to others. And that's really the base understanding of us understanding how we can apply what prophets did and who they were to our lives today, currently. Last week, Zach kicked us off talking about Samuel. Samuel was the last judge and the first prophet, and kind of talked a lot about just the huge life that he had, so many of those hot points that he kind of talked about early on. I'll encourage you to go back and listen to that message. We put all of our resources online for you to catch up if you miss a couple weeks during the series. But he kicked us off talking about Samuel. And I can't do justice by trying to recover those things, but I do want to look at the last 5 things that we kind of talked about, we learned from Samuel, and especially from his story of how he was called out by God. And that's this. These 5 things. That God desires to speak to us. That there is a desire for God to communicate with us. I love the second one. We don't always hear very well, right? Somebody give me an amen or nod your head or something, right? That's true. We're not very receptive people. Number 3, that God speaks to us primarily today through His Word, that His Word is living and active. The Bible itself is given to us to be His truth for us. Doesn't mean that He doesn't still speak to us individually, but He will never speak to us that's something contrary to the Word He's already given to us. So that's primarily how He speaks to us. Number 4, that God is patient with us. Hallelujah. All right. Number 5, God has spoken to us through Jesus, primarily through His life, not just the words that Jesus would speak, but oftentimes I tell people, if you want to know what Jesus meant by what Jesus said, you got to know what Jesus did. You got to look at the actions of His life. You have to know what He did in His life in order to really understand the full character and grace and mercy and love and all of that of God in form in terms of Jesus and fullness of God and man. And so that's kind of what we pulled out last week, this big picture of God communicating with us and messages to us and messages for us, the same as the prophets themselves. And so today I want to jump into another story. We're going to talk a little bit about the timeline. Very quickly, I want to kind of give you the context of the history of Israel. All right, so Samuel, he anoints 2 kings, Saul the first king and David was the second king. All right, and they had kind of a heyday. I mean, the Jewish people had kind of a heyday, if you will, during David's reign. I mean, it was God's blessing and favor and just victories and awesome things happened. Even all the way through Solomon, David's son, who followed him up as king. But after Solomon, things went south. South in terms of the fact that it actually went south. They actually divided the kingdom. There was a division in there, north and south. The kingdom split. And all of a sudden, everything that the prophets, the judges and the prophets actually said, and when everybody was crying out, give us a king, God, and they're like, no, you don't want a king, trust me. No, we want a king, really. No, trust me, you don't want a king. And of course, now we're seeing why that was a very bad idea for them. And matter of fact, in the northern kingdom, I think there was a king that basically only lasted a day before he was also overthrown and killed and burned and families and everything else. So there's just all these things happening. And this is all prior to God's ultimate judgment of his people, where they're actually conquered completely and actually thrown into exile. So this is prior to that. This is after Solomon when the kingdom split. And the northern and southern kingdoms, sometimes they had good moments of following God and living out his ways. Most of the time they didn't. They were rebelling against God. They worshiped other gods. And that's what we see in the north. The north, there were several kings. In 1 Kings, you'll read, several kings in the northern kingdom that just kind of went in and out. And they all kind of mentioned this bad king named Jeroboam. It's like, they all kind of are referred to, hey, you followed the path of Jeroboam. You went away from God's plan, even though God wanted to work in and through you. And prophets would come to those kings. All these little prophets would come to those kings and try to help the people of God turn back to God. And then all of a sudden we get up to the context of our story now with a king named Ahab. And the story's going to start from there. The prophet to the king Ahab was a man named Elijah. That's more of a famous prophet. You maybe heard from him if you were in Bible school, vacation Bible school at any point in your childhood. Elijah was this prophet. We don't get the whole story on like Samuel. We don't see where he got called from God. He shows up on the scene in 1 Kings, and we just see that he is the prophet of God. So here's the main characters, if you will, of the story we're going to kind of dive into today in terms of Elijah. Well, there's Elijah first and foremost. He's God's messenger, right? He's God's prophet. He's God's messenger. Then we have Ahab, all right? Go to the characters real quick. We have Ahab. And, all the kings before him, as kings would recall it, said, hey, yeah, they were as bad as Jeroboam. You've followed the path of Jeroboam. Yeah, when it talks about Ahab, it actually says, you know what? You are worse than him. Like, you're more evil, more despicable. You have provoked God's anger. And this is what's said about Ahab as a king. He's the worst king to date, so to speak, up to this point. And part of that is because he marries Jezebel. All right, now, if you ever wonder where the term Jezebel came from, it's in the Bible. Actually, believe it or not, real person. And so Jezebel is a pagan king's daughter, and they get married, and she actually is like a priestess. She brings back into this culture, the Jewish culture. She brings back in the worship of Baal. And Asherim as well, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but this is all bad news in terms of what's happening for the people of God. And so up to this point in the story where we're going to jump in, Elijah's come to Ahab and said, there's judgment coming to you from God, and he basically says it's not going to rain. And it didn't rain for 3.5 years. Elijah was taken care of. God fed him by birds. Birds brought him, cheeseburgers and stuff by the river. And he had a little stream, giving him some food, which was great. I'm just hungry, so that's how I think of cheeseburgers at that point. He was taken care of, and God did some cool stuff through a widow, as Zarephath as well. But for Ahab and Jezebel, they were fighting pretty hard to end the drought. And Jezebel actually was killing all the prophets of God and other gods outside of Baal and Asherim. They were killing all the prophets. And they were trying to put an end to this drought. They were trying to put an end to the suffering of their kingdom. And so finally God tells Elijah, hey, it's time to go back. It's time to go back. It's 3.5 years. It's time to go back. So he actually goes back by way of the widow of Zephram, and he goes back. And there's a couple of more characters I'm not going to get into. But he shows back up to talk to the king. And this is where we're going to pick up this morning in 1 Kings 18. If you have your Bible with you, I'm going to put the rest on the screen. I'll do my best to go through this story. Hopefully it's a pretty well-known story for many of you. For some, it's brand new. So we're going to walk through it pretty slowly and really kind of dive into this experience, this moment in Elijah's life. 1 Kings 18, starting 17. Ahab, that's a good guy. This is a bad guy. Ahab saw him and exclaimed, so is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel? That's a good greeting, right? I have made no trouble for Israel, Elijah replied. You and your family are the troublemakers, for you've refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. Now summon all of Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who are supported by Jezebel. Now, really quickly, just in terms of context, it's like Baal is not a god, it's kind of a multiple gods all there, and Baal was often represented by the bull. Asherim was sort of the female deity, in terms of their life. So all this religion was like the sun god and the moon god and the yin and the yang and the female and the male, because all pagan religions have a lot to do with sex. So there was a lot of that going on. So that's the whole idea of Baal and Asherim, even though Baal is the one we concentrate on in the story. He says, bring them all, 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who were supported by Jezebel. And Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel. And it goes on to say this. Elijah stood in front of them and said, how much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. And the people were completely silent. This is interesting in this moment. I don't want to skip over it, but that Elijah actually states this proposition that you have to make a choice. There's a choice to be made. And by that whole proposition of making a choice, people didn't know what to say. They were completely silent. And again, that's hard for us sometimes to understand. Our freedom, our little culture of freedom and tolerance says you don't have to choose anything, right? Matter of fact, making people make a choice is the wrong thing to do. And here's Elijah saying, no. Hey, look, if God's God, follow him. If it's Baal, follow him. Like, stop wavering, stop hovering between these two opinions. Why were they wavering? Well, God, as they understood it, was a grandfather story. He's a distant memory. He was a story grandpa weaved, so to speak, in our lives about who God was. But nothing really relevant to who they were today. But the problem was Baal had allowed this drought to happen. So Baal was failing them miserably. They're dying, they're suffering, they're experiencing this horrible drought for 3.5 years that they didn't even know was coming. So they don't know what to say. They're completely silent. You're asking us to choose between something we don't even know and something that's not working. And it's an interesting proposition. Well, he's setting them up for the story. So he actually says, all right, look, there's one of me, there's 450 of you. Let's both offer a sacrifice. Let's get 2 bulls. You prepare the bull, you pile the wood, I'll do the same. But listen, you can't light the wood. Here's the test. He says, whoever's God will light the fire for the sacrifice for them. Wins. Okay, basically the words are, that will be the one true God. And then Elijah very politely says, there's 450 of you. You guys go first. That was very nice of him, right? Just you guys go ahead. You go first. And so we can pick up back in the story in verse, 26. There we go. He says, so they prepared, this is the prophets of Baal. He said, they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. They called out the name of Baal from morning until noon, shouting, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced and hobbled around the altar that they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. This is an awesome scene. "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed, "for surely he's a god. Perhaps he's daydreaming or in the bathroom," right? Or maybe he's away on a trip or is asleep and needs to be wakened. So here's this moment where it's about noontime, it's been a few hours, and Elijah decides to mock them and say, hey, maybe you just need to work a little harder. Maybe you need to try a little bit more. I don't even know if you guys are really into it right now. Maybe your God needs to be woken up. So it keeps going. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, which kind of freaked me out, they cut themselves with knives and swords until blood gushed out. I don't know if you've ever seen a wound that gushes, but it's not pretty, right? That's their normal custom, so they're putting really effort into this, shouting louder, cutting themselves, keep going. And they raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but there was no sound, no reply, no response, which up to this point was what they had already been experiencing. Keep going. Elijah called the people and said, "Come over here." And they all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. I don't want to skip this particular part because this part is important. Many times when you and I kind of stray, and we're just going to put ourselves in the position of the people that are there. Many times when you guys, we stray away from God's path, we kind of stray about and kind of go off on our own. There's a lot of times that in order for us to come back to God, in order for us to really kind of reconnect in that relationship with God, some of the things that we tore down need to be repaired. Some of the bridges we burned need to be fixed. Some of the things that we did need to be repaired. And there's a physical act here that Elijah says, okay, I'm going to take what was once the altar of God and I'm going to repair it. before we even begin this sacrifice. So he goes on to say, and I'll kind of paraphrase for you. He took 12 stones. They all represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And as he began to repair it, he dug a trench right around the whole thing. He cut up the bull, put the sacrifice on there, put the wood, piled the wood high. And then he asked the people around him. He said, "Go get these 4 large jars," and he says, "and pour it all over the sacrifice and the wood." And so they did that. And then he said, "Do it again." And so they did it again. And they looked at him and he said, "Okay, now do it one more time." So 3 times, so much water so that the trench, you finally see the trench that he dug around the altar actually kept all the water right there, continuing to saturate this from the bottom up, this complete, the offering and the wood and everything and the stones. And I don't know if you've ever been, in the woods, trying to start a fire with wet wood. I don't know if you've ever tried that before, but it's a lot of rage and fury with no actual result, right? It's a very difficult thing to do. And this is what he has kind of set up in this moment. 3 times, just douse it and let the whole thing just fill so that all of this water remains there. And then he begins to speak. It says, at the usual time for the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I've done all of this at your command." So this is not just a brilliant idea that Elijah came up with. This is all by God's command, all by God's doing. When he says, "Elijah, it's time for you to go back," he knew what he was going to be doing. He says, "O Lord, answer me so that these people will know." And this word, if you go back to the Hebrew, it's a word of conviction, okay? That they will know without question that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself. Prove this so that they will know. I love this. Immediately. No waiting for the response. No hesitation. Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. Now, if you're a sci-fi geek like me, okay, I want you to think of the word vaporize. Okay, I want you to think about that word because that is what they're experiencing. This is not a campfire moment. It wasn't just like a little spark in here that happened. We're talking about the fire that came down and took out the bull and the wood and the stones and the dust and all the water that was in the trench, leaving nothing but a little dry ditch. And that's this moment for them. And when the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, He is God." Yes, the Lord is God. Basically, He wins. Okay, right? That's the moment. You win. And then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape." So the people seized them all. Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley, and he killed them all there. Okay? Now that was left out of Vacation Bible School, just to let you know. There was no felt boards with knives, and I don't know how they did it back in those days. And he killed all the men and women of the prophets. Children go to snack. That's what they don't do that, right? And I know it's hard. This is one of those moments where it's hard. We can barely understand in our civilized Western culture the tip of the iceberg of what this society was like, what it was like in this time, why in the world God would allow it, why in the world would God command it, and there's just some of those things that we won't ever be able to fully understand because we have no concept or clue what it was like. We trust God. In this story, this is the moment when God's people have acknowledged him as God again. They don't even know. Again, this is a God of a distant memory. This isn't a God who's something they immediately knew all the answers to. It's just that moment of, it was an undeniable moment for them to go, "You're God. That's it. You win." And then the mercy and grace of God comes as soon as this is done. Elijah goes up on the mountain and prays for the rain to come, and the rain immediately comes. And God's grace just rains down on his people. Brings the crops back, brings everything back, and restores them. I want to end the story there, but not because I feel like the outcome necessarily is what's all of that important in terms of this moment. I believe it's important, but I don't want to focus on just the outcome of them acknowledging God. That's a big deal. I don't even want to fully focus on Ahab and Jezebel and where they were and what continues to happen in the story, because Elijah's a flawed, failed man. James, the brother of Jesus, who writes the book of James in the New Testament, he goes on to describe who Elijah is, and he says, look, Elijah is a man just like you and me. He's just like us. There's nothing supernatural about him. He is a man just like us. And we learn from Elijah's full story that he is flawed, and he gets scared, and he actually rebels at some point. Or in this particular moment, I just want to look at one concept as we kind of park here for the rest of the day. One idea, one thing that I think that we can glean from this story and begin to learn and apply to us. And that is this. We often seek the explainable in our lives. And we rarely seek the undeniable. We often drift and sort of seek to those things and those answers and those reasons that are explainable to us, especially when it comes to our faith, especially when it comes to God. And we so rarely ask for the undeniable. As we see in this story, as we see in this moment, this experience that the people of God we're going to have. And I don't, some of it, I mean, again, it's me. I'm not, maybe you are much more holy than I am, that's fine. I'm just telling you about me. I drift. Anytime that I'm sharing my faith or talk, I mean, I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to explain things for a living. That's apparently my job. But I drift often to moments and experiences and conversations and counseling and places and times where I oftentimes find myself just simply asking God for the explainable. You know, the times where you and I have the thoughts of, I wish I could just say this one thing that would help them understand. You know, an unbelieving spouse or a wayward kid or a brother or sister, a sibling who rejects God, and you're just like, I just wish God would give me just one thing, one simple thing that they would finally get it. If I could just explain this. Or a question that someone keeps asking and keeps bringing up, and they have an issue they keep, and you're just like, okay, God, if I could just explain away that issue in their life, they would fully, come to you. They would fully understand. And again, I think for me and for you, often the simple outcome we try to seek is something that's explainable. And the reason I think that it's that way for us is that we're comfortable with things we can explain. We're so comfortable. We don't mind engaging in things that we can explain or we know something about. And this is true about life. You shy away from the things you can't explain, especially when it comes to faith. Someone starts talking about why he killed all the prophets of Baal, and you're like, I don't remember that part. They didn't teach that in VBS, right? I don't remember that. Let's talk about Paul. Let's do that. Let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about something else that I feel like I can explain better, or something I can feel like I can kind of have a reason for. We shy away from the things that we can explain fully. And so much of Christianity in church world doesn't just want us to go towards the explanation. They want us to saturate ourselves with knowledge and saturate ourselves with things that we can explain so that we actually become arrogant and judgmental. And we still shy away from the stuff we can't explain. We still shy away from the things that are not something we know, but we rise to those things and pride to those things that we feel like we can use for our advantage. We're more comfortable in the areas of the things that we can explain. It's just natural. But isn't it funny that explanations don't actually work? Explanations are not something that all the time actually help anything. It doesn't even bring change to someone's life. It doesn't. That question that someone has, you finally have you called them up and had coffee because you finally have an answer. You heard it last Sunday at church. You finally have an answer for them and an explanation. It didn't change anything. They still don't believe. They still have trouble. They still struggle. It didn't actually do anything. My kids, this is a few years ago, my kids down the street, we had a neighbor kid, and he was convinced that his woods behind his house was haunted. He'd heard some things, and he was convinced he saw some things, and then my kids go over there, and he's convincing them that they're the woods are haunted behind the house. And of course, I'm the father, looking at my kids, going, "It's not haunted. It's not." Try to explain to them. I'm their dad, the flesh and blood. I'm trying to explain to them. No. Explanations didn't matter. Why? Because it's their friend who they love and trust. No, he's convinced it's haunted. It must be, right? Oftentimes explanations aren't enough, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again so that this is just true in our life. Listen, Our experiences will always trump what we know. Our experiences will always trump our knowledge. Our experiences will always trump and win over the things that we think we have some sort of hold on. Now, experience is my word for the year. I love the word experience. If you're tired of me saying it, I'm going to say it about 80,000 more times this year because it's my word. I'm all about understanding and experiencing God more than I am trying to understand the answers or trying to figure out how to explain God. I want to, like Ephesians 5 says, I want to experience a love of God that basically, that even Paul says, yeah, you can't understand it fully, but you can experience it fully. That's what I want. And experiences will always win. Experiences will always trump. And there's these things in our lives, there's these undeniable moments and experiences that can happen because of who God is that honestly we just can't fully explain. We can see it in a mother's love for a kid, for their kids. We can try to explain it. You know, there's a bonding hormone at birth and there's all these. You can try to explain it, but we scratch the surface on what is really there. And if you are a child who's ever experienced that from your mother, you know it without it having to be explained to you. Because of the experience that you have an undeniable knowing about that. That's just so true for us. This beautiful thing. I don't know if you know this guy, the Iron Cowboy. We was talking about it last night at a party I was at for the Kilgoris Project. They just returned for their 2-week trip. We were hearing some stories. And David, who was a friend of mine, was talking about this Iron Cowboy, James Lawrence, who had done 50, I don't know if you know, 50 Ironman events in 50 states in 50 consecutive days. And it was ending last night. It was this beautiful story. And I went on to read a little bit more about him because I was so intrigued. And I was like, oh man, I don't know how that's happening. And it's hard to explain. Even the beginning when it talks about why he's doing what he's doing in terms of inspiring people, that explanation barely scratches the surface of what's really probably going on down deep inside this guy. How he pushed through 50 consecutive days in 50 states to do 50 Ironman triathlons. And then I look at it and go, we can't even explain really how he did it. I mean, he had doctors and people all around him, and they even Trump said, look, honestly, the physical body wasn't meant to even do all these things. We're doing our best. There's some things that honestly we just can't explain how he's pushing himself physically to be able to do this. And listen, that's just physical. That's just something physical that last night at 10 o'clock when he finished, that there was an undeniable moment and experience that they will never forget. Him and the people who witnessed that. They will never, ever, ever forget it. It will change them for the rest of their lives. And that is just something small. That is just something physical and mental. You and I are talking about these moments, these unexplainable or undeniable things that are the power of God, the supernatural power of God in our lives, working in and through us to have a point in our life where we just say, look, if you could just feel what I feel, if you could just experience what I experience, you'd get it. Because those are the things that are undeniable in our lives. But we so rarely seek these undeniable things. We look at those physical things, those things like James Lawrence says, I get it, but it's still, a lot of it's unexplainable, but it is an undeniable thing. We're talking about things when God works through us, the power of God works through us. We're talking about marriages that stay together after an affair, and they don't just survive, they thrive. That is an unexplainable thing, but yet it's undeniable. We had it 2 months ago in Charleston when 5 days after loved ones were taken from them, brutally shot and killed in a church, that people were standing in court and looking at the assailant and looking at the murderer and saying, I forgive you. Jesus forgives you. You can't explain that. Yet it is undeniable what the power of God is doing in and through us. So I have to ask you guys, because I want to ask this question before we move to, we kind of put it on anybody else, but what's the last experience you've had with God? That is so undeniable, you have a hard time explaining it. That you personally have had some of these moments, some of these crossroads, some of these areas in your life where you and God have come to something and there has been evidence of change. There has been evidence of power in your life. There's been evidence of something that is absolutely undeniable, even though you might have a hard time putting words fully around it. When is the last time that happened for you? When's the last experience you had? I mean, I think about the ones in my life. I think about that I was a kid and I didn't understand salvation, and I'd lie to my parents pretty much all the time. And so, every night I went to bed, I was worried. I was worried I was losing my salvation. I had to pray to ask God in my heart every night. And there was an undeniable moment in my life when it was explained to me and I finally understood it. And it was something that was just God revealing to me. I didn't have the words then, that there was nothing I was going to be able to do to make him love me any more than he did right then. And there's nothing I had done to make him love, I had ever done to make him love me any less. And it changed me. Later in my life, my call to ministry, the thing I had rejected for years, the thing I told God I'm never going to work for a church. Churches are horrible, right? They're horrible places to work for. I'm never going to do it. And a mountaintop moment, an experience that I had a hard time even explaining to my wife in that moment. What was absolutely undeniable in me. I'm your pastor today because of an undeniable experience. Not an explainable thing. Not an explainable thing. This church should have folded and closed its doors. And 5 years ago was a whole different story of what this church was. Shouldn't have happened. Didn't make sense on paper. But these undeniable moments exist. They're the things I look back to. They're the moments in time that I look at things and say, I know I can't explain it all to you. You just have to trust me. You just have to trust God. It is an undeniable power that's at work, that's bringing this kind of change and doing this in my life. It is not me. It's not me. And listen, I'm getting a little older, but I'm tired of trying to explain people to Jesus. I just want to say, look, if you just would meet him, your life will never be the same. If you would just surrender your will for his will, you will never, ever, ever be the same again. I can promise you that. I'm not against Bible study. I want you to learn. I think there's things to learn and to know and to study and to be aware of. But far too often we are seeking knowledge for the wrong reasons, and we are not often enough asking God, bring me something, do something in me that is undeniable through your power, through your work of the Holy Spirit in my life. I love this. This is the way Paul described it in 1 Corinthians. He wrote a letter to the Corinthians. There were some leaders that were trying to take them off the path. And my wife reminded me of this a couple weeks ago, and it was just such a beautiful, way to cap off this understanding in our language. There were some people trying to take their, the church off path. And so Paul says, look, I'm coming back. And this is what he says in 1 Corinthians. He says, I'm going to come to you very soon if the Lord's willing. And then I'm going to find out not only how these arrogant people are talking, but what power they actually have. Why? Because he says this. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power. The kingdom of God is not a matter of talk. It is not a matter of what you can and cannot explain. It is not a matter of what you feel like you have answers for questions that honestly no one's asking. It is a matter of power. It is a matter of whether there's change. It is a matter of whether there's something lasting. It is a matter of whether there's something that's convicting you. It's a matter of the power of God at work, in and through your life. People don't need any more explanations. They don't oftentimes need you to come at another angle so they can figure it out finally. They need to see the power of God working in you. They need to see that there are these, they don't need to know that there's hope from an analytical level because of the situation they're in. They need to see in your life, is there an undeniable, absolute hope that you have? That no matter what's going on in your life, it remains there. In order to do that, we have to ask God for it. So what are you asking God for? And that's really the question. This is it. This is your homework for the week. What are you asking God for? The explainable or the undeniable? What kind of message do you want to deliver to your top 5, to the people you're investing in relationship with? What kind of message do you want to be a part of? Something that's just simply explainable, just some tic-tac reasons as to why it matters? Or have you ever prayed that God would do something undeniable in someone else? I'll tell you this quick story. I was sitting across from just a gentleman that I had known for a while, and he was walking away from the faith. He thought he believed. He felt it was a hoax. He felt like it was a crock. He felt like there was other answers. He'd been enlightened by some other things, and I sensed, and I tell you this, you have to be very careful. This was something I feel like honestly was just a piece from God. As I was listening to him explain, I was sensing from God saying to me, just let him go. Just let them go. Like there's no reasons and explanations to be given to try to make this conversation go differently. And so I was listening and I was going, that's awesome. That's great. Good for you. Great. Go do that. Go do that. You will always be welcome at Journey. You will always be loved by your church family. You will never be judged and cast judgment from us to you for the way you're going to live for the next few years. But I am praying that God will do something undeniable in your life. Now, personally, I was praying that God would do something very quickly that would cause him to mess himself. That's my prayer, okay? That's me. That's Matt Dawson talking. That's where I got to be careful, right? So that's me saying that, saying, God, get a hold of this person. Do whatever you got to do. Tear everything else down till all that is left is you. Because personally, I want to see this person return to the faith and accept the hope of Christ. But at this point, even as Paul says later in one of his letters, he says, sometimes it's better to just let them go. Let them go and deal with the consequences of what they're going to deal with so that when they return, they will return to the hope that I'm bringing to them. They will finally get it. Why? Because there will be something undeniable about that moment. Not just two wavering opinions, as Elijah set the whole thing up. Two wavering opinions you guys keep going back and forth about, but neither one of them seems to be working for you. Let's get ready to have an undeniable moment. Let's get ready to have an undeniable experience if you're open to it. So what are you asking God for? For you? For the people in your life? Listen, I do agree that there's some things that people need explanations for. I want you to sense the Spirit's working when you are required in your heart to try to give you, Peter even says, give an answer to the hope that you have. You do need to have reasons and explanations, but do not be praying and seeking by default the explanations and reasons. Begin to start praying for, God, would you do something undeniable in me that I can share? Would you do something undeniable in them so that they would, without a shadow of a doubt, know that you are God? Jesus told his disciples and told us by proxy that we were going to be his witnesses. We were going to be his witnesses in Judea and Samaria and to the rest of the world. We were going to be the messengers of God to speak truth to others. What are you asking God for? That's all I want you to think about this week. And I would say, there's several of us in here. Yeah, God does need to bring you a message that is explaining some things to you, but I'm pretty sure that most of us in here need to be asking far more, God, would you do something undeniable? Would you give me an undeniable experience? Cause me to take the steps I need to take. Surrender the will I need to surrender and get out of the way so that I can experience something with you so I will know you are God. Let's pray together this morning. Heavenly Father, I just thank you for who you are and for your word in our lives. God, continue to convict us that we too often pray and seek answers and explanations, when our outcome really should be, God, work in power in and through us. Give us undeniable moments and experiences where we can actively see you at work, changing, transforming, doing something in us that only you can do. And we will look back on those things as anchors, as pillars, as rocks of our faith because they are undeniable. God, I pray for those that we are investing in, people that we are trying to witness to, people we're trying to share our faith with, people we're loving, people we're experiencing a relationship with that we want to draw closer to you. May we not so easily always default to trying to explain things. May we seek more of those undeniable work in their lives as well as ours. We thank you for the story. We thank you for Elijah. God, he was just a man. He was flawed. He was not perfect. But he followed you. He was surrendered to you. God, we want to live out that example so we can experience those undeniable moments in our lives. We pray all of this in your name, Jesus. Amen.